everyone. Okay. And hello, everyone. Very good evening to all, and thanks for joining this call. I'd like to appreciate the interest that you are showing towards the technology and the RPA learning stuff. So, highly appreciate it. So, today topic is one of the most important and something that is very easy to understand, but it is very important in a way like it plays a major part when you're developing a bot in UiPath Studio. So whatever you develop, it can go from an ideal situation and then lead to an exception or any error at any point. So unless those are handled, the bot execution might fail at any point. So in that way, error and exception handling is very important in UiPath. So with that being said, I would like to start with a code that it is all we know already that often prevents us from learning. So the reason why I want to mention this is there could be many people who are in this session who are very new to this topic, and this will be a great learning experience for them. And there could be few people who are already aware of this, but still it will be a value addition for their knowledge. So the reason is like we'll be having a two-way interaction. So whatever queries you have, please feel free to come up with your queries, and you can mention that in the chat, and we'll try to address them at different points of this sessions. So please keep your mind open and then sit back, relax. So let's start the session now. So the key takeaways for you people from this session would be like what is the exception and what is error is actually about, and what are the common exceptions that you can come across when you're developing a bot workflow in Studio, and how to handle those exceptions with the different techniques, it is with the different activities that you can use in Studios to handle those exceptions. That includes try catch, throw, rethrow, retry scope, and global exception handle. We will be seeing the usage of these activities one by one once we get into that agenda. And fourth, we have a practice session where I will be trying to give you a scenario which you can try after this session is over from your end with your studio, and get your hands dirty so that you'll get to know how to face different kind of exceptions when you're going for a real-time enterprise level of development. And finally, I would like
Yeah,
to
pardon
share.
me, can you just keep your voice a little higher?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I'm audible now. Clear?
Yes, you're clear now.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have the learning resources where I would like to share some of the links where you can get to know about these topics more in detail. So you can see at the last. So let's go by the topics one by one. First is what is the error and what is the exception is actually about. So errors, I would say like when you're developing a bot, um, we are writing some expression and suddenly there shows some kind of a red color warning message or a pop-up that you have done some kind of a compile error or what is it like a kind of a validation error. So unless you resolve those errors, you won't be able to execute that activity or a sequence of activity anymore. So those kind of a validation that needs to be handled is something we term it as errors. That is errors or events that a particular program can't be handled, can't be dealt with unless it's resolved. So you have to resolve whenever you are facing or whenever you have created an error, because the reason why I'm telling us you have created because errors are created by the developers. It's only when it gets resolved we can run further and then we will get to see the exceptions. So errors are something that occurs even before bot execution. So we need to ensure that all those errors are validated and resolved, and only then we can compile and then we can run the bot. So errors usually being in that state, we used to see syntax errors and user errors. Syntax errors in a way like when you're trying to write an expression in UiPath Studio and suddenly is there say for example, you have missed a comma, you have mixed a semicolon or a double quotes for a string, then it would throw an error that you have missed this. So please correct that. So unless you correct that, that validation error will keep coming. So that comes under the syntax error, where user error is something that um, you're trying to give an input which is a string format, which actually should be a string format, but unknowingly you're giving an integer. Say for example, instead of ABC, you are giving 123. So that is something, an input coming up from user side. If the user input is not valid when you are developing in a studio, when you are trying to assign some value, then it shows an exception. That is something that can be handled by the user itself. It's very known and it's very straightforward. You can just find it very easily and you can change that. So errors, to be short, it is something that needs to be resolved, and only then you can run a bot. So make sure when you are developing any bot or any workflow in your studio, and whenever you see any kind of an exclamatory mark or any highlight in the box in the sequence, make sure that you are resolving it, validating it, and then you try to execute that. That is something that comes under errors. Whereas exception is something that comes after bot execution. Say, for example, you have resolved all the errors, you have done some syntax error, and by the way, you have resolved it and you have executed successfully. But when you are trying to execute that, you might come up with any exception. Say, for example, you are using an Excel application and Excel application suddenly crashes and it is not able to read the data from the Excel file. Then it might throw an exception that bot has failed because of this exception. And that is something that comes up from the application level. And that we call it as application exception. There is another kind of an exception that comes out of a process. Say, for example, you are developing a process and it is not going as per the expected way of approach. It's getting deviated from the expected way of approach. In that way, it throws an error, which we call it as business exception. So any exception that comes because of the business process is called as business exception. And it's not necessarily to be handled. It's not completely, what to say, mandatory to be handled. It can be categorized. First, it can be recognized, categorized, and handled in a way you can just ignore that and you can still continue with the bot execution. Or there are other options that you can still resolve it and then go for the next transaction. So it can be any way. So exceptions doesn't need to be resolved. It can be skipped, it can be solved, or it can be just ignored. It's not like an error. Like error is something that needs to be resolved, but exception is not like that. You can just skip it or just ignore it and continue with the next process or next set of activities you have in studio. So, so to be in short, exceptions are events that can be recognized, categorized, and handled even if it's not resolved. So uh, now what I would like to do is, like, I just want to show you some kind of a common errors and exceptions in studio, so that whenever you come across such kind of a pop-up or a validation error, then you can try to solve it in a similar way what we are going to do now, and then you can proceed further. So now let's try in studio. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. It's quite large, I believe. Or if you want to just increase the screen size. Okay, okay. Am I clear now? Am I audible now? Am I still?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, perfect.
All right. Fine. So if you can see my screen in the studio, I've just created an assign activity where I have tried to create a string variable. All right. Just a second. I've tried to create a string variable which has no default value. I have to say like no value at all. It's empty. And now I'm trying to assign the value through an assign activity, and which has a value 1, 2, 3 space. Okay. And I want to replace this space. I just want to remove the space. That's it's as simple as that. And I'm trying to use a replace method. And I've just left this expression as it is, but I'm thinking like, okay, this expression is fine. But still, this shows me an error. If you can see here, just like replace accept this number of arguments. There are some arguments that I still need to pass it to the replace method. That is, if you see here, if you see here, just I have mentioned only one argument. Actually, there could be more than one argument, right? And if you're not clear with how many arguments I need to pass to a method, what you can do is just remove this and press Control space. Right. 1 second. If you see here, this replace accepts two arguments. One is the old character, another one is a new character. But I have mentioned only the old character. That's why it was showing a syntax error. So now what I need to do is I need to give two arguments. One is with the space, the old character that I need to replace. Another one with the value that I need to replace. So now if I once I have passed these two arguments with the right syntax, this error has gone. So in similar way, you can come across any kind of a syntax error. And if you have done a syntax error by like what to say unknowingly, you will get to see a kind of a warning message like this in that specific activity itself. So make sure that you just see that error, what is that error is about, and try to rectify that so that that error will be cleared. And that is something a kind of a syntax error. And when you go for a user error, let's let's make it very simple. Okay, I've told you that there is a variable which is of type string actually. Okay, in a way like it will accept the value between double quotes. But here have passed it as a number without any double quotes. And I'm still getting a exception like this. Not an exception, error like this, sorry. And if you see the error, option strict and on this allows implicit conversions from integer to string. So this is something that user gives the value, right? So these are the errors that user makes while developing the bot. So what we can do is just remove this and place the value between double quotes. So the error will be gone. So as I told you, unless you clear these errors, let's say like I've kept like this, 1, 2, 3. Unless you clear these error and when you're trying to run a bot, the bot won't run actually. It will throw an exception in the error list. So errors are something that needs to be cleared before you execute a bot. So it's as simple as that. And let me try to put this in the right way. So these are the errors, the common errors that you come across when you develop a bot. So to keep in short, whenever you get through these kind of any kind of a warning symbol, make sure that you're at the activity and try to see what is that error and rectify that. And only then you can execute the bot. So next, let's see about the exceptions. So let me get back to the slides. And the most common kind of exception that you can see in Studio or in any kind of a bot development, be it a business level or with an enterprise level, you can come across two major kind of an exceptions. One is system exceptions, and under that system exceptions, there can be n number of exceptions that comes under that type. We term the system exception as a type. Under that, we can get to see a lot of system exceptions. Say, for example, null reference exception, index out of range exception, selector not found, argument exception, text not found exception, and application exception. So these are something that the reason why I've listed out these are something very common that every developer will come across when they are developing and testing their bot. So now let's see um, how these exceptions will be. I would like to take the first two, for example. Let's get back to the studio. And here, if you see, I've tried to recreate that kind of an exception in a way. So here, again, a same kind of a string input, which is of type string and it has no value. It's simply an empty value. And when you're trying to process a variable which is empty, you will get to see an exception like this. I'll show you. Okay, if you see here, system dot null reference exception. So whenever you run a bot, and if it faces any exception, and this exception comes after executing the bot, that's why I told you error is something before execution, exception something after execution. So we got this exception in a way like the source is, it lists out three major inputs for us in a kind of a box, a window wizard, where we get to see the source where it got failed out, that is the if activity, and the message why it got failed out, that is object reference not set to an instance of an object. Okay, so object in the sense like what kind of variables we have used in this if activity. It is only that string variable, that is string str underscore input. And let's see what is the exception type so that we get to know why it has exactly got failed out. So which is something that system dot null reference exception. So as I told you before, this string variable is passed without any value, right? So unless it's been passed with a value, this will show an exception like null reference. Now let me try to pass a value, okay, in a same way, 1, 2, 3, or any symbol like that. So let me try to pass a value and run the bot. Okay, let it be. So that error has gone now. We didn't get that error. And the reason why I want to still execute is I want to show you the next exception that we come across in common. That is system dot index out of range exception. So here, if you see, what I have done is now the exception has crossed this, and we are not getting any more that null reference exception. And now it has gone through the then part because the length of the input is more than one. We have three of length here, so it's more than one. So it has gone to the then part. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to split the text in a way like, say for example, I have 1, 2, 3 hyphen, and now I want to get 1, 2, 3, and that is before that delimiter hyphen. What I have done is I have used a split method where I have passed the input and a delimiter and the index position that I want after splitting that. Actually, it has to be 0, but unknowingly I have passed it as 2, or by some other input which would have got more than one delimiter, I would have passed as 2 as an index. But here, if you see, there is only one index and there is no more than one delimiter. So we won't be able to get any element at index 2. So that's why it was showing an error as index out of range. So these are some of the common exceptions that we come across when we are developing a bot and once we have executed that bot. So all these kind of a system exceptions or a business exceptions will be appearing only after we execute it. So whenever we develop a bot, we need to ensure that these exception, whatever activities that we can expect an exception can be thrown out of that activity, we need to ensure that activity is handled with an exception. So there are different ways to handle an exception. We will be seeing that in the next, the next slide we are coming across. Um, these are something that comes with the system exception, but there are few other exceptions that comes as a business exceptions. So I would like to differentiate between system and business exception. That is, system is something that throws out of an application or throws out of the, what to say, studio, or any application that you use in your process might get crash or might not behave in a way that we look for. It might behave in a different way so that the bot won't be able to execute further. So in that scenario, bot will throw a system exceptions. And while we come to business exception, when we are developing a bot, we develop a process as a bot, right? And there can be a chance that the bot process can deviate from its happy path, right? So it can deviate from its actual expected way of behavior, but and it might throw an exception at any point. So those exceptions that comes from the process, we call it as business exceptions. And that is what I have mentioned it as business exception. So these two are the major exception, that is system and business exceptions. And under system exception, these are the exception types that falls under a common exception type called system.exception. So this is something that we can define from the studio itself. Like what to say, it gets defined by default. We don't need to define in an explicit way, but this business exception has to be defined, has to be declared by the developer. So unless you define that as a business exception, it will still fall it as a system exception. So when you want to categorize it, okay, I want to categorize this as system and I want to categorize this as a business, make sure that you're categorizing it unless it falls in the same exception type. So before we get to the techniques to handle these exceptions, I would like to have a pause here and get through your queries. If you have any queries so far, please mention in the chat. We'll try to address that and then we will go ahead further. So any queries so far? All right, an example of application exception. Any further queries? I'll try to tie up between them and then I'll try to explain that if we have any other queries. Okay, okay, application not responding. Okay, argument 2, please. Okay, fine. Happy path. Okay. Okay, let me try to go one by one now. To start with the happy path, we term a terminology like happy path is something that we call it as the actual process. Say, for example, you have a process and it starts with an input and it process and it creates an output and it goes in a expected way without any exception, without any business exception, without any application exceptions. It just get the input, process successfully and prepares the output. That is what we call it as happy path. And if there is any deviation from this, say for example, it has got the input, but unfortunately there is an application exception. So the bot behaves in a different way, right? So unless that application exception is handled, it will behave in a different way. And if it is being handled, then it works accordingly to what we have set. Like say, for example, if an application exception occurred, we would have developed in a way like, okay, close the bot and then rerun it, or close that application or try to reopen the application. So it runs accordingly. So if it deviates from what is being expected, then it is not a happy path. If it runs as expected from end to end without any deviation, without any exceptions, like uh, it starts and it process, it ends very smoothly, then we term it as happy path. So that is what we call it as happy path. When you will come across when you're developing a number of bots, when you discuss with other developers, you can use this terminology. And that is one thing. And I will be showing an example for application and application exception that covers both an example and application not responding. Argument expression, I can explain. I will try to help you, like I'll try to explain like how it will be happening. So that will go to the studio. And before that, I would like to check if there is any other queries in the chat. When elements are not loading, when you click on or navigate some specific buttons. Okay. Okay, that still comes under an application exception. Say for example, as you said, when an element is not loading and it takes more time than the ideal time it should have taken. Say for example, you have an application and you just click a button and it loads another page for 10 seconds. That's the ideal situation. But at times, if the network is not good and if it takes more than a 10 second or it takes 10 minutes or even a day, then it's something an application exception. So what you can do is that application exceptions can be still handled with the techniques that we are going to discuss in the next slide. There are a set of activities that you can use to identify and handle those exceptions. So with those methods, you can handle those kind of scenarios. That is one thing. So undefined exceptions. Okay. Undefined exception is something, say for example, you are running a bot and you have you have tried to develop a bot only based on a happy path. That is, input comes, process successfully, output comes. But sometimes if the application crashes, sometimes the process deviates from the way it should be, then it will be throwing an exception, right? And that it is something we call it as undefined. So it depends on the process. It varies from different process. It's a common terminology that we call it as a undefined exceptions. If an exception, if you are anticipating, okay, in this place we might expect an exception, and if you're anticipating to that place, you have to handle that activity with an exception handling technique. That is, if you are trying to use a click activity and you are anticipating that that click activity might fail or may not fail, then in that case you have to handle that click activity in a way, if exception comes, then still that click activity needs to work, or it can continue or it can ignore, or if not, the click activity is working fine, then it can continue as per the expected path. So an exception will become an undefined exception only if it's not handled in the studio. So when you're developing a process, I would suggest in a way, at any point, if you're anticipating that this portion of the process might throw an exception, make sure that you are handling that exception. And that handling can be done with set of activities. I'll come up with those in the next slide, and I'm sure that you will definitely get an idea like how an undefined exception can be handled. Um, it's not about the internal exception. We call it as a business rule exception. That is something that comes along with the UiPath. So as I told you, system exceptions are something that the bot itself, that the code that you're developing, say for example, the .NET framework itself will throw that. But the business exceptions are something that we need to categorize it. So that is something that is being provided by UiPath. It comes under the type class like UiPath.core.business rule exception. Whereas the system exception comes like UiPath system.exceptions. It's as simple as it's just a namespace that we usually get it from .NET. But business exception is something that we need to define. That's the only category, I would say, an extra category that we need to define. So as I told you earlier, whenever you're anticipating an exception across the process, it's not only about the application. Anywhere across the process, if you feel like it may get deviated from the happy path, then you need to define a business exception and handle that. So that is what the internal exception category is about. And business exception equal to application. No, there is no such limitations, but I couldn't still get the question exactly what you tried to mean. Like, is it like business exception equals application? Can you just elaborate it that? So that meantime, I will try to explain about the other queries with the studio, as I told you earlier. Uh, okay, an example of application exception. I'll do one thing. Um, I'll try to comment this out and use a read range activity, and I'll try to get a file for you. I'll copy with this path and make sure this demo data file is opened. Now, if I try to read this sheet and just mention all the range, now what will happen if this file is not close, if this file is not opened, I'm not using this file, right? Then the bot will be able to execute this read range because the file is not being used by anyone. But now I have opened this file in an edit mode. So let's see like what bot is throwing an exception or not. So I have kept that file open, and now if you see, it will throw an exception, that system.io exception, which is something, a business exception, where it's being used by another process. So what I need to do is I just need to close this and run the bot. Then it should be fine. So this is something that is what I termed as application exception. So I just closed it. The bot will come appear here and it runs fine. Simple. So this this is something that I am doing it now. But what if when the bot is running, suddenly the Excel file gets opened and the bot fails in the sense? That's not something the expected one, right? So this scenario has to be handled with some kind of a technique. And that is what we are going to look at in the next slide, which is what are the techniques that we can use to handle these kind of common exceptions. Techniques is what I try to mean is about the activities and the features that UiPath Studio provides us to use and handle these exceptions. So another thing that I want to mention about the argument exception is something. It can be a property argument. Say, for example, this read range has a property, right? And there are some mandatory argument that needs to be passed to an activity, which always comes under the category input. And if you're not passing any value to any of these inputs, see here, I have mentioned all the values for all the arguments, all the properties here. So if I miss any of these properties and if I try to run, then it will throw an error, which could be an argument error. And that is one type of an argument error. And another thing is, say I have a main file and I have an exception type file, which is another sequence or another file I'm using, XAML file. And if I'm trying to use some arguments and get value from this main file, okay. And if I'm trying to call this workflow there in the main file with the invoke workflow file activity, and if I'm not passing any value to those arguments, like how we did for property without any values, then it will throw an argument exception. But let me give a try with this argument. Let me just give this one and try to run. Let's see like what error it shows. Because I have not mentioned the sheet name, right? It will be probably showing that sheet is not there. See, the sheet doesn't exist. This is something that comes under the argument exception. So we need to make sure that each property, which are mandatory properties, has to be passed with some value, and that to a proper value. If the proper value is not passed to those arguments, then it will throw an argument exception. And most of the mandatory fields in the property will fall under input category. So make sure that you are mentioning all the properties. So that is the argument exception. So now let's go further with the slide considering the time now. Let me go with the slides. Just give me a second. I'll just move this up. Okay. So as we told, we have seen all these kind of exception. Argument exception selector is something that if you're trying to indicate an element in application or in a web browser and suddenly that element is not loading or it's not appearing, then it will throw an exception that bot is not able to find that element, and it's a selector not found exception. In a similar way, you get argument text not found, application exceptions like that. And the business exceptions are something that we need to define and declare in the studio, only then it will get handled. So now let's get to the common technique that needs to be used to handle these kind of exception. First is try catch. So maybe let's get to the studio directly, and I would like to show you like how try-catch activity will work. So if you see here, try-catch, fine. Early, I have told you in a way like I've used a read range activity. I have used what to say. I have opened an Excel file, and when I'm trying to read that file, it will obviously throw an error because that file is being used by me, right? Now, if I want to handle that, I can surround this activity with a try catch. And you can use that, you can bring the try catch in your studio with just a right click on top of an activity like this. Once you right click, you can see an option called surround with try catch. That's it. And that activity will get surrounded now with the try catch, right? Now let me try to explain like what each block of these try catch will do when an exception comes. I have already built a code on top of it. So if you see here, I have used a read range and I have also kept that file example.xls opened. Now, what we need to do is when you're anticipating an activity in your workflow that it might throw an error, and if you want that, if it might throw an exception, if you want to handle that exception, you need to surround that activity with a try catch so that when that exception appears, it will get to the catch block. And in catch block, you can categorize what kind of exception you are anticipating for. Say for example, if that activity might throw an application exception, you can mention that as a category. And if you're expecting a business exception, and you can still categorize that in the catch block. So in a way, you can have multiple number of exception categories in a catch block. So place the activity that you are anticipating for an exception in the try block and mention the category that you are expecting that this type of exception would occur in the catch block. Say for example, here I have used system.io exception. That's the exception that we have seen when we were trying to read that file. And when I was explaining that when you are using a read range activity and keeping that file open, you will get that IO exception, right? So I have chosen that exception as a category. I will tell you like how to choose that. You can just click here and then click the drop down. And if you could see the IO exception, you can select here, or if not, you can just browse for IO exception here. And if you see here, you can see n number of exception under system category, and you can choose the one that you need, right? And inside that exception, okay, now you have identified the exception. The bot has seen the exception. It has caught the exception in the catch block. Now what needs to be done as a next step? Either you can ignore that exception and you can continue further, or you can consider that exception and stop the bot right away. So if you see here, what I have done is I've just included a log in a way like what is the exact exception has happened. So you can write that with the exception dot message, which is what is the exception message, and add source. Source is something, the place where that exception has happened. And once that, what I need to do is, okay, now I'm reading a range, the Excel file is open, so it is throwing an error. So first step I need to do is I need to close that application, right? So that is a remedy step. I'm adding that in the catch block. And now what I would like to do is, once I have closed the application, I need to still read that Excel file again, right? So in a way, like once you have caught the exception, you have handled the exception, you still need to do something that you can handle that in the final block. So whatever activities you add in this final block will get executed for sure. That is, if the exception has occurred, still it will go to the catch block and the exception is handled, and still this final block will get executed. And no exception has occurred and it has not gone to the catch block itself, still this final block will get executed. But there is one scenario where this final block will not get executed. That is, if you have a catch block here, and if you're trying to use the remedy step instead, instead of adding a remedy step, you want to stop the bot right away, then you will be rethrowing the same exception. There is an activity to rethrow that exception, which we call it as rethrow. So if you just add this activity inside the catch block, it will try to rethrow the same exception. So in that case, the bot will not proceed further. It will stop here itself. So which is very obvious that it won't execute the activities which are in the final block. So to keep it in short, try block is something is that we need to place the sequence of activities or a single activity or a flow chart, whatever it is, that you are anticipating, okay, an exception might come here, be it a system, be it a business exception. If you're anticipating out of that, then keep that in the try block. And in the catch block, you can include n number of exception category. Now I am adding a system exception. Now I'm again adding a business exception or null reference exception. And now I'm adding a business exception. Business exception is something that we need to find in the browser. Say, for example, business rule exception. I told you, na, this is something that's been offered by UiPath. It's along the DLL. So you just need to call this so that any business exception that you get through will fall under this catch block and try to execute the activities which are under this block. Okay. And that is about the catch block. And finally is something that will get executed if there is no exception, or if there is an exception but it is handled, and if it is not rethrown, only then the final block will get executed. If the exception occurs again, say for example, you're adding a sequence of activities here, and again that activities, if it throws an exception, then the activities in the final block won't get executed. So that is about the final block. Now you might come up with a query that, okay, you said system.exception will cover all the IO exception, will null reference exceptions and all, except the business one. So system.exception is the prime one, is a prime, what do you say, a parent method under which all these categories will fall under. And suddenly, if the activity in the try block throws an exception, say for example, IO exception, you might come up with a query whether it will go to this catch block or the parent one, exception system.exception catch block. To answer that, whenever an exception is caught here, it will always try to go to the specific exception type, not to the parent. Okay, it always go to the specific exception type. Here system.exception, this one exception is something a parent exception type, and IO exception is something a child exception type under that system.exception. And if the sequence of activities that you have in the try block meets a child exception, then it will go for that child exception only. That is IO exception. And if it goes with the general exception, then it will go for the parent one exception. And if it is something that is a business exception, then it goes for the business rule exception. So this is how the catch block will work. And this is how the try catch activity will work. And I told you that these exceptions are something that comes out of the activity without being defined. That is system exception will be caught without being defined. But business rule exception has to be defined. Only then it comes under this catch block. That is, it comes under the business rule catch block. That is, you are reading this input, and if it is not able to read, and then it comes to a system exception. That is something that comes by default. Say, for example, you have read the file, and inside the file, if you are reading a string, but someone has given input of integer, some junk characters, and bot is not able to process in the way like, you need to define that exception. That is, you need to throw that exception as a business exception. And for that, we will be using an activity called throw. So when you want to declare or when you want to create a business exception, it has to be defined by the user, and it can be defined with the help of throw activity. So throw activity, what you can do is you can just go to the property and you can define a business exception like this. This is a syntax for creating the business exception. New business rule exception, and whatever business exception message you want, you can keep it. Bot is not able to process the data. So when bot is not able to process the data, it will throw a business rule exception, and this throw will create a business rule exception by through the bot, and it will go to this catch block. So that's how it works when it comes to the business exception. And I could see some queries in the chat. Let me try to see that. And all right. All right. I think Manoj Batra is really doing a great help for me. Thanks, Manoj. Okay, understood. Is there anything that I still need to address, Manoj? If you're not, if you're unmute, can you mention me that?
So you can answer the last two questions.
All right. Can rethrow be called outside the catch block? Okay. And okay, fine. So as I mentioned, rethrow can be used only inside the catch block. You cannot use outside the catch block. And say, I'll just try to do that. If you see here, if I'm trying to add this rethrow, it will throw an error. Rethrow activity must be a child of a catch handler. So it can be used only inside a catch block. Only a throw activity can be used anywhere. It can be a try block, can be a catch block, or it can be a final block. So you can use the throw activity wherever you want, because the reason is throw activity comes first, and I would say rethrow activity comes after that. So once you throw an exception, only then an exception will be thrown, it will be created, and it will be caught by a catch block. And inside the catch block, if you want to just rethrow the same error, you don't need to recreate it, just add the rethrow activity. So the purpose of the rethrow activity is just to recreate the same error that you met at last. So that's the reason why the rethrow activity can't be placed anywhere apart from catch block. So to keep it in an organized way, it has to be placed, and it can be placed only inside a catch block. I hope that answers your query. So rethrow can be placed only in catch block, and throw activity can be placed anywhere you want. So as simple as that. Perfect. And can we give exception message in config file and integrate the same message? Of course you can. So you can have any kind of an exception message. You can define that in config file, and you can read that config file and get that as a dictionary variable or any kind of a data table variable you want. And you can pass the same in the throw activity or wherever you want to define exception, because at the end of the day, this throw activity is going to accept a string variable, right? So you can pass it in any way. You can read a dictionary, you can read a config, you can read a data table, anything you want. So the final thing we need is it has to be passed as a string. So only that string arguments is being accepted by the throw activity. So you can keep it in config file also, it's completely fine. And that's right. The business exception would be based on the user requirement. I think Manoj has addressed it. Thank you. Fine. So let's go ahead further if there is no further queries. So far we have covered try catch, throw, and rethrow. So throw, I just want to highlight one more thing. So it's not just that you can define only business exception in a throw activity. If you want at places, if you want to define a system exception also, you can still define that. And the syntax for that would be like this. You can create a system exception as well. It's not that only the bot will create. You can define it by your own like this. and just mention the exception that you want to, exception message that you want to highlight. Application is not working. That's it. So you can define a system exception like this, as simple as that. And if you want to define a business, it's a very simple business rule, then it becomes a business rule, something like that. It's very simple. So now we have covered try catch, throw, rethrow, and what are the blocks that try catch that contains, and how each block of the try catch will work. And now let's see about the next one, which is retry scope. So if you see here with the retry scope, I have a scenario for you people. You can try even in your machine in a way like I'm trying to open the Acme test, which is a common website that anyone can access who are trying to practice and learn UiPath. So you just type this URL and you get to that page. You can log in with your credentials, or you can sign up with your own credentials. And then you can just, what I have done is I have already opened this page. I've kept this page open. Now what I want to do is I just need to open this employees tab, and the bot needs to stop until it finds this pop-up. If the pop-up is not coming, then it will still try to open again and again. And if the pop-up comes, then it will close it. Say for example, if this scenario is not handled with the retry scope, if you're just having this attached browser alone, okay, let's see like what it happens. Okay, now I just have this attached browser. I'm just trying to run this file. Debug file should be fine. Okay, it's getting into the sequence now. So I'll open this file. Okay. Now if you see here, it has opened this, and we can see this pop-up luckily. So let me try to explain the way like how it would be if it goes out of the happy path. All right. So say for example, this pop-up is not coming and you want to retry the same activity again. And what we used to do is like we used to have a while or a do while, or we can have a loop, but that's not the optimal way of approach, I would say. And the best way to handle both the retry and also the exceptional to handle that is something that we can use an activity called retry scope. And what you can do is it has got a set of blocks to use with, and you can just add this retry scope activity here and place this activity that you want to retry if it is not going as per the expectation inside the action block. And you can use some set of activities inside this condition block. Condition block in a way like this activity will get executed until this condition is met. So it will keep executing this activity to the number of times you want until the condition that you keep is met. That is, you can use the condition, you can use two different activities, I would say three, but to keep it very simple, let's see about the basic two activities that we can use in this condition block. One is element exist, another one is image exist. So you can use element exist or image exist in this condition block. Let me try to use an element exist now. And I'll try to drag it here, and you can just click and indicate this closed button. So if the bot tries to see this pop-up, then this action block should stop and proceed with the next set of activities. That is, we have defined with that condition. If that element is not highlightable and if it's not an individual element, then you can use image exist. And there is one more element that comes under the Microsoft package, which is true or is false, which is something that these three activities can only be used in this condition block. The reason is this condition block will accept only a Boolean kind of an output. Say for example, this element exists will produce a Boolean type of variable. If you see here, it's a Boolean type. And again, if you use image exists, a Boolean type. And even in that is true activity, it's a Boolean type. So only an activity that gives out a Boolean kind of an output can be used in this condition block. And this activity inside the action block will get retried again and again to the number of times you have mentioned until this condition is met. So you can use this retry scope along with the activity that you are anticipating that it might take more time to load. There was one question in the chat even that what if a button takes more time to load, and can we use an element exist and other set of activities to handle that exception in the scenario? The very simple way is that you can go for this retry scope, where in the condition block you can use an element exist and highlight an element that could appear once that page has loaded completely. Until then, it has to try some set of activities again and again, right? So those set of activities can be placed in the action block. So what this retry scope will do, will try to execute this action block again and again until that element is appearing or visible or is met. So, okay. So I told you like you can do n number of retries, right? That can be defined in the properties here. You can mention how many times you want. You can mention that retries, and you can also mention the time interval that needs to be followed between each retry. So you can mention that time interval here and the number of retries you want. Okay, this is one scenario. And say for example, there is a scenario where you won't see an element itself. What we can do with this still, what we can do with this retry scope, you can still run this retry scope with only the action block having activities, and you don't need to have a condition block. So this activity will run unless an exception is seen, right? Like it will keep running until an exception is met. Say for example, business or an application, any application is met, right? So it will keep running. So that is also another way that you can use without any condition. So there are multiple options that you can still handle an exception when it comes to a page reload or and refreshing a page. Or I'm just trying to mention that scenario as an example, but this retry scope can be used anywhere you want based on the process that you feel. And especially in a place where you want to retry the activities to the number of times until you meet the actual condition you want. So this is how the retry scope activity work. And let's see the chat. Is there any query on this? If not, then we'll go for the other one. Okay, can we have an example for exception bubble, please? Okay, I think it's been addressed. All right, there's no queries on this. Let me go ahead further. So the next one, the next activity, or I would say a handler, which is very important that every bot developer can use. And it's not that any exception can be handled with these four activities itself, but still there can be some scenario, right, where we may not expect as exception in any point. Like say for example, there could be many places where you cannot expect an error, but suddenly an error has come. But that error has to be that exception has to be handled, right? In that situation, if you are not clear that an exception can occur at any point, and if you're not clear about that exact place, and still if you want to handle that exception and continue with the further transactions, then you can use global exception handler. So what this global exception handler will do is, at any place when an exception occurs, and if that exception is not handled with these four activities, and which is in a way like that exception is not at all handled, then it will be caught and handled by this global exception handler. So if you're finding a scenario where you're not clear when an exception will come, then keep this global exception handler as a file, as an XML file in your project, in your bot workflow, so that it will get handled. So this will be very useful when you're not clear when an exception would occur, right? That something that every developer will be always worried about. Okay, I'm not sure like this will work or not. And suddenly if that doesn't work, that has to be handled, right? So in that scenario, you can use this global exception handler. So let me try to explain that in a very simple way. I have that in Studio. Give me a second. Okay, this one. So, okay, say for example, I have this main file. Okay. Okay, we have 7. I have a good amount of time. We'll try to complete that. Again, I'm using a simple scenario here where I'm trying to use an assign activity with an integer variable, and I'm trying to convert a string as an integer, just not an actual case, right? So it will be throwing an error. Obviously, it will be throwing an error, but I'm not surrounding this activity with any try catch or any rethrow or throw or any retry scope activity. I'm still trying to run it as very simple, right? But still this will throw an error. Now what I need to do, even though this throws an error, I still need to continue further, and I want this log message to appear. Like I want to continue with the rest of activities. So what I have done is I can use a global exception handler. How we can do is in Studio, under the design panel, you can see a new option where you can see a global exception handler. So once I'm clicking this, you will create a global exception handle as a separate XML file. Or if you don't want to create a separate XML file and you want to reuse an existing file as a global exception handler, that is, if a bot gets into an exception, unfortunately, then it has to get into a separate XAML, which will be acting as a global exception handler. That is, we can reuse a current existing XAML file as an exception handler. It's not that you need to create a new file. And if you see here, I have already kept few. I'm sorry, I just have tried to test it out of mine. And if you see here, I'm choosing any one of them and then just right clicking it in the project panel. And you can set this also as a global handler. So it's not that you need to create a new one. You can also make use of an existing one. And usually a global exceptional handler will have two arguments, which you cannot remove, or I would say you should not remove. That is, one is the in argument, another one is out argument. In argument is something that if any exception occurs, unfortunately, then it will call this global exceptional handler and pass that exception to this handler. So it comes through an input in argument through this variable called, to this argument called error info. And once that exception is caught, handled, it has to send a result back to the other workflows, right? It has to send a result through an out argument, and that is what we have result. So now I hope you understood why this is very significant that we should not remove these arguments in a global exception handler. These are very mandatory. You can have any other variable arguments, that's completely fine, but these two arguments should not be removed. Only then this global exception handler will work as expected. And now if you see inside the global exception handler, we get these activities by default. When you create a global exception handler, if you try in Studio, we get these activities by default. It's not created by me. And if you see here, first it tries to log the exception that it has got. And as I told, it comes through the in argument through error info. And here, after that, we are trying to do a set of activities. That is, once an exception, that is an unknown exception or undefined exception that many people said has come, then it will come to this global exception handler, and it can be handled in 4 different ways. Either you can continue, that is the exception is rethrown, or you can ignore that exception and then continue with the next set of activities, or you can retry the same activity again, which was throwing the error, and you can abort the execution. So these 4 steps can be performed based on your need. Say for example, if you're developing a process and you are coming across an undefined exception, and if you still want to continue, you can choose continue in the result action, or you want to abort, you can abort, you can choose that as a result action, or you can choose any of these 4 actions. And that's 4 actions can be mentioned and can be passed along the result out argument. If you see, that is a retry. If you see here, error action dot retry. Instead of retry, I can just mention as abort or continue. If you just click a dot, you'll get to see the properties under that. Continue, or you can mention as ignore. You can mention like that. So this result will get passed as an out argument, and then bot will try to proceed further. based on the action that you are mentioning. So you can choose any of these action in a global exception handler. So the choice is yours based on the process that you are handling. So now what will happen is I'll just remove all these. I'll try to run what I have created so that we will save some time. Remove, delete, yes, delete, yes. Now I will just keep this as a global handler. It'll ask for yes, and I'll open this. Now, if you see here, what I have done in the global exception handler is I have tried to remove all those if activity, everything, all those fancy activities, and just kept it very simple that ignore that, simple. So ignore in a way, what will happen, it will try to execute the rest of activities. Say, for example, if this exception is coming and it goes to the global exception handler, it will just ignore that and tries to execute this. Oh my God, okay. Okay, it will try to execute this next activity. So let's give a try now. I'm running this bot, and so if you see here in the output panel, first it has given the log message as before assign activity, and this didn't work, and it goes to the global exception handler. And here as a first log is an error message that gets displayed, and it just ignores. And next is the current retry number, which comes as a next log, and it get back to the same workflow where the bot was, and it will try to continue with the next set of activities, that is as after assign activity. And say, for example, if I don't want to ignore, I just want to abort the bot, and the bot won't proceed further at all. It will just abort and stop there. Let's see here, like it won't, if I just abort means it won't execute this activity. This log message won't come. The after assign activity won't come. It will stop abruptly where the abort is mentioned, right? So now what I will do, I'll just run and you can see like how it works. See, the bot has aborted. As simple as that. It won't proceed further at all. So whenever you're trying to choose as per the process that you are handling. You can choose among the four, whatever. Again, maybe to show that, I'll just open you that. So you can choose any of these actions. Among these four actions, you can just choose and then make use of that. And again, to be very clear, this global exception handler will work only if that exception that comes along the activity is not handled with the try catch, right? Or with the retry. So unless, only if it is not handled with any exception handling activities, then that exception will come into this global exception handler. If it is handled by retry or a try catch, then it won't come to this global exception handler. So you can make use of this global exception handler if you are not clear when an exception will come in your process. So it will be very useful in that situation. So hope I'm clear with the global exception handler and its usage. And this can be used both unattended and in attended mode as well. The explanation, the workflow that I have shown you now is for unattended one. Say, for example, you have a user who wants to run a bot in an attended mode, and suddenly an exception that comes which we have not even like thought about, and suddenly it has appeared, and but the user still wants to continue that. In that case, you can include this global exception handler along that workflow which is being treated as an attended bot. In a way, like when an exception comes, you can throw an input dialog box and let the user to choose among the four options I showed you, right? We have got these four options, either to continue, ignore, retry, or abort. User can mention that in the drop down, and based on the input given by the user, bot will try to perform accordingly. Either it can continue or ignore or retry. And I do have an example for that. Let me try to show you. That's a very simple one. All right, I don't know that. I just think I have it. So let's create it. It's very simple. Okay, I do have, yeah. So if you see here, again, it's the same scenario where I have using a read range and I'm keeping this file open. Demo desk. Okay, I'll keep this file open for your info. What I will do, okay, I'm just double clicking this so that the file get open. Now what I will do, I've used a global exception handler where I have used the input dialog box where the title is choose action, input label is please choose the next step for the error that occurred. And I will try to give in multiple choices an option and the 4 options that I will try to list it out so that the user can choose among these 4 options that we usually get out of global exception handler. And after this, based on the choice made by the user, it has to go to the specific set of activity and that can be done with the help of a switch case. So here I have used a switch case where based on the choice being chosen by the user, it will go to the specific block and try to run that. Now let's try to execute this and see like how it works. If you see here, this file is open. Now an input dialog box will appear that if you see, because it's being used by another process, right? Now this is something known, but still you can use this for undefined exception at any point in your workflow. Now I just click this drop down and I could see the 4 options that we get out of global exception handler. Now what I want to do is I just want to retry this again, the same activity. Let me click retry and click OK. And again, if the exception is not handled or if the error still appears, then it'll throw the input dialog box again. If you see here, the input dialog box appears again. It still shows that this has been used by another user. So now what I will do, I'll just abort the bot. So now the bot execution will stop there abruptly. That's it. So you can use this global exception handler in different scenarios, and it's highly recommended when you are not able to define an exception. So you can use it for both attended and unattended scenario. So these are the techniques that you can use with the activities, right? With exception handling techniques. But there is one simple thing that you can do when it comes to an UI based activities. UI based activities in the sense like whenever you're trying to interact with an activity and interact with an element in an application, say for a button or a field in a desktop application or a web browser application, whenever I try to click or type in any value to that, sometimes that field or a button may not get loaded completely or may not be visible. In that case, you can handle that with try catch. You can handle that with global exception handler. It's completely fine. But still, to just keep it very simple, you don't want to handle that exception, but still you want to continue further. You don't want to handle or you don't want to categorize that exception itself. Then what you can do with those with that activity is you got a property called continuous on error. So this continuous on error is a kind of a Boolean property. When you use a UI based activity, you can see this continue on error as a first property in that activity. And if by default the value is false, as I told you, it's a Boolean kind of a property. By default, the value is false, which means if that activity is not able to access the element or type in any value to a specific element, then it will throw an error. But if the continue on error is set as true, then even if the bot is not able to access that element or if you cannot type any value, then it will still try to continue with the next set of activities. So that's the one of the biggest advantage that you can use if you don't want to categorize any exception. So if you see here, I'll just try to explain with the previous scenario itself. Okay. What I can use is, okay, retry scope. Okay. Now what I will do, this is something that interacts with the UI, right? Attach browser, attach window. If you just search activity here, attach browser or attach window, it comes under the UI automation. So whatever activity that comes under the UI automation, it would have got a property called continue on error. And by default, as I told you, it will be set as false. If you try to set this as true, okay, Even if this browser application is closed, it will still continue with the next set of activities. Now I have chosen this browser, right? Now what I will do, I'll just try to close this browser. Okay, this browser is closed. Now what I will do, I'll just run this bot. The bot will still not throw any error at all. It will run and then close, as simple as that. So you can use this continuous on error whenever you feel like you don't want to categorize that error. And we usually use this continuous on error only if you are so sure that, okay, this activity anyhow will not work, but still let's keep it. And let's see like whether if it works, then it's fine. If it doesn't work, then it's also still fine. Then in that case, you will be using this property. But I'm trying to mention this because there is an option to handle that kind of a scenario as well. You see here, I've closed that browser itself, but it still didn't throw any error at all. So you can use this property in such kind of a scenario. And there is one more thing, that if you are, if even if you see here, this send hotkey is another UI based activity. So if I choose this alone as a true and not this attached browser as true, now this, if I run this, it will throw an error, right? Because I have not chosen this as true, it will throw an error. And what will happen if I choose this specific activity alone as true, then only this activity will not throw an error if this doesn't execute as expected. But if I have a set of activities inside a scope in the sense like attached browser or attached window or any scope in the sense like a set of a block of activities inside a scope. So we usually use attached browser and attached window as a scope, and we used to place the set of activities inside the scope, right? But what I'm trying to say is, if you enable this continuous on error on a scope level, that is on an attached browser or attached window as true, any activities inside that scope, if any UI based activities inside that scope, if it's not working, then it will still continue further, because you have defined that in a scope level itself. Even if you have not defined this as true, it will still execute because you have defined that scope as true, right? So that is something that um, that that's something that continuous on error property offers us. So if you are trying to enable that on a scope level, then the activities inside that won't throw any error even if it is about to throw. So that is about the continuous on error property. So these are the techniques that you can use to handle an exception when you are developing a bot in your studio. So before going for the practice material, I'd like to check with the chat. Is there any further queries? Okay. Global exceptions are obligatory when using business exception, or would be the best practice. Yep. If you are very clear with, okay, this is where I'm going to get the exception, and this is where I'm sure I'm expecting an exception, then it is not, global exception handler is not required. But at some point, if an exception might occur without your knowledge, or it can occur, right? It can, there is, it's always um, good to anticipate for an exception that can come out of your happy path, right? So in that scenario, if you have used this global exceptional handler, then you can try with the different approaches. Say you can retry, or you can abort, you can continue, and you can handle that exception in a different way you want. So that is something that global exception handler offers. Or still, if you're not using the global exception handler, and suddenly if an exception that you have not, and like you didn't expect, but it appear in the sense, then it will try to fit in somewhere in the exception that you have defined already. Say for example, you have defined a system exception, and that is not the exception being defined for the one that might occur, but it still fall under that, and your bot will still continue with its execution. But if you want to manage in a very organized way, like being very critical bot, and you don't want to miss any kind of such exceptions, then you can use this global exception handler, and you can be very sure that that exception, any exception that appears, is being handled. So that's something that we can try, or you can use with the global exception handler. It's not mandatory, but if it's been used, it will be a well organized and well developed one. So any exception that appears or and like come across your board execution, it will be handled for sure. Exact difference between throw and rethrow activity. Okay, fine. So throw, as I said, it can be used anywhere. To be very simple, throw activity can be used in any place you want, be it a try class, try block, catch block, final block, or in a sequence or in a flow chart, anywhere you want, you can keep that. So whenever you put a throw activity, you define an exception, right? You are creating an exception. Throw is something that is used to create an exception. That is, you create an exception. You define an exception. So it can be an exception that is a business exception or a system exception. So when you are creating using a throw activity, you can define a business exception with new business rule exception, and you can define the message you want to throw, or you want to throw a system exception also. You can define a system new exception with the message you want. So that is also possible. So throw is something that you can use anywhere, and it's something that you creating an exception. So if you want to throw an exception that you are sure, okay, the bot didn't meet the business need, and you want to throw an exception, then you can put a throw activity there in an if activity or in a if condition. Say you are using a user is trying to input a password, and password only accepts a string or other characters, and if it deviates from that, if the user is not giving any input to the password, then it doesn't meet the business need, right? It is not as per the business need. Then you need to handle that also. Then in that case, you can check with the user input with an if activity, and inside the if activity, if the input is empty or null, then it goes to the then block, where you can click this throw activity, where you can, in the throw activity, you can define a business exception that the user has not entered the input correctly, hence a business exception is thrown. Likewise, that is for throw. When it comes to rethrow, rethrow activity can be used only in a catch block. It cannot be used anywhere. It can be used only inside a catch block of a try catch activity. So when you use a rethrow activity inside a catch block, it will try to rethrow the same error or the same exception that was caught at last, the recent time. Say, for example, you have a try catch block, and the activities inside the try block throws an error, and it goes to the catch block. What you want to do is you just want to log the exception and then rethrow the same exception. In a way, rethrow the recently occurred exception. Then what you can do is you can just add the rethrow activity there. So it will try to rethrow the same exception that has occurred recently. So that is the main difference between throw and rethrow. I hope you answered that. I hope answered that. Thank you. Perfect. You have any further queries? Or if not, let's go for the last practice session and then we'll wind up for the day. So practice scenario is something that you can use an Excel file, something like this, where you have you can take month cash in, cash out, sum and status. So what you want to do is you need to add these two values, that is sum and get the value. So for that, whenever you read a Excel file, you get as a string, but you need to convert that to integer. So only then you can add, right? So you just need to read, convert that to integer, add the value and place it here. And if it was successfully added and entered here, then you need to mention as success here. And say, for example, that's not the challenge, right? It's very easy. 15 plus 15, you can convert the string to integer. 241, you can convert the string to integer. But here, you see 150K is there. K is not an integer. When you try to convert that 150K from string to integer, the bot will fail. And you should not stop the bot when the bot tries to see this seventh row and tries to convert this value. The bot should mention as not successful, and still it needs to continue with the rest of the row. It should continue with the next row and do the sum and mention the status. So this is a scenario, and this can be handled with the try catch, or it can be handled with the global exception handler, retry scope, anything you want. So this is a scenario. You can do it. This is very simple. You can just create an Excel file and you can have this, and you can have two columns with the numbers, but having strings and other special characters like hyphen like this. And when you try to do this, bot won't be able to do the sum on top of this. It will throw an error, and it still needs to handle that error and continue with the next transaction. That is the next row. So you can try this scenario, and then if you have any queries, you can come back to us. So we try to help you with that query. Yeah. So that's it. I think we are done now. Let me check whether Rohit is there. You have any further queries? We have 2 more minutes left. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And I will also share the resources that you can refer, the docs for each activities. Rohit will be sharing you this slide, and you can check with these and you can get it done. So thank you for being more patient, and hope you guys found it informative. Yeah. So Rohit will try to provide these details. You can, if people were not able to attend this, they can still try to see that through a recording, and it will be shared with the link to you. And thanks for joining, and have a good day. Thank you. So Rohit, you're there. Fine. Thank you all. Thanks for joining this call, and it was a great time. And hope you guys found it informative. And if you have any queries, please reach out to us. You can reach out to us through forum and different platforms. Be glad to help you at any point. Have a good day, and thank you.